afternoon, guys, and happy Christmas Eve to you all. I hope you're doing well. I hope you're getting some downtime over the Christmas period. It's incredibly busy, isn't it, Christmas? It's not really a holiday, let's be honest. There's not much chilling going on, especially for those that have got to actually cook the Christmas dinner tomorrow. So I especially feel for you because hosting Christmas and doing the dinner is a big job. Very fortunate Mum does a cracking Christmas dinner. So Richie, I just bring the desserts. That's my role, just bringing the desserts, which I do go and shop by because nobody wants me to make them. They won't touch them otherwise. My family don't appreciate my cooking and baking skills, but I do understand I'm not the best. Anyway, I am bringing you another history vlog today. I thought since it's Christmas Eve, a little bit of story time, that'd be quite nice. And it's really windy outside, so I can't do it while I'm kind of moving around the yard or going for a ride. So that's why we are stuck in the tack room. I'm going to attempt to do some tack cleaning, but I'm not actually sure how much will get done because sometimes I find it hard to tack clean and talk to the camera at the same time. And when it comes to a history vlog, there is so much information to remember, which is why I've got notes. And I do often have to stop the filming, read the next part, because it's much nicer if you sort of just read it straight off of your top of your head rather than reading it from paper. It never comes across so well then. I have done my absolute best to find as many pictures and photos for this vlog, but it was surprisingly hard. In fact, probably the hardest one I've done. This vlog took quite a long time. It's a lot of research, but it's a really interesting one, and I found out lots of things that I never knew about. So you'll have already seen from the thumbnail, it is all about the Great Western Railway at Paddington Station and the Mint Stable Yards, which was owned by Great Western Railway, and the amazing railway horses that were based there. I do also want to say a massive thank you to all of you that watched the last history vlog, which was the one on the Great Manure Crisis of 1894. I think I've got that right. You really surprised me. It got watched far more than I was expecting. Sometimes the history vlogs don't do that well, but you guys seemed interested to know about the Great Manure Crisis, which really never happened. So thank you so much for watching that. So before I chat about Mint Stables and the horses based there, I want to just touch back on Paddington Station. So it first opened in 1838, but not where it currently is today, but on a site west of Bishop's Bridge Road, obviously not there still today. And then it was moved and opened in May 1854. And this was Great Western Railway's kind of grand terminus. And it's a splendid train station. So everything I'm chatting about in today's vlog is referring to the current Paddington Station. Many people thought that once the railway was kind of throughout the UK, that actually horse-drawn transport wouldn't be needed anymore. Literally that horses would no longer be used, but that absolutely wasn't the case. In fact, if anything, they were needed more. Let's leave Paddington Station and head over to Mint Stables, which was obviously owned by the Great Western Railway. Now, hopefully I've put enough pictures of kind of aerial shots so you can see just how close the stable block was to Paddington Station. They also had a huge depot yard slightly further up the road. So at one point in time, Great Western Railway had 600 horses based at Mint Stables. That's a lot of horses. And something I didn't know is that railway companies back then were the biggest users of horses in the country. I just assumed it would always be like the omnibuses or the trams or maybe even like the stagecoaches or the Royal Mails that would use horses the most, not the railway. Because of course, like I said earlier, a lot of people thought that once the railways really took off in the country, that actually horses weren't going to be needed anywhere near as much, but it was completely the opposite. They were needed just as much. And the reason horses were needed so much is they kind of did two jobs in the railway. They were either used for shunting the trains, which is when the trains were moved across the lines, or they were used to pull the big heavy wagons that had all the goods put on them. So obviously goods needed to be taken to and from the train station and also to wherever the location is that they were going to. And this was needed to be done by horses pulling the wagons. So actually they needed a lot of horsepower. Literally, the railway companies were like the modern day delivery service or freight companies that we have to this day, literally just moving goods to and from places. So the GWR mainly owned big, strong dray horses because obviously all their work needed a horse that could take a lot of weight. So moving the trains across the lines would need a very strong horse, and pulling these wagons full of goods, again, would need a very strong horse. So Mint Stables were built back in 1878 by GWR, and they still stand to this day. You can still go and see them. Obviously, they're no longer stables, but you can still see the actual building. The stable block stands between South Wharf Road and Winsland Street, and it's right next to St Mary's Hospital. And in fact, now the stable block is part of the hospital. Over the years, Great Western Railway had to expand their stable block because as the company grew, they needed more and more horses. So in 1884, they added a second storey to their stable block, and then in 1897, a third storey. So it really was a multi-storey stable block. Can you imagine having your horses on 3 floors of a building? Like, to us nowadays, it's kind of unheard of, but back then it was actually really common. The horses on the 3rd floor must have had an amazing view across London. And I did see a picture, sadly I couldn't get permission to use it, where this horse is actually looking out the window and literally has the most phenomenal view across London. I mean, back then they'd have been totally used to it. It wouldn't have been anything unusual for them. But nowadays, I just can't imagine going, all right, you've got to go upstairs a few floors before you get to your stable. I say stable, obviously I mean stalls. Back then they mainly used stalls, which they'd need to, because if you're housing up to 600 horses at one time, you're not going to be able to have 600 stables in what is a relatively a small site. So sadly, they were all in stalls. Obviously, there weren't any lifts to get the horses up to the 2nd or 3rd floor. So they would have ramps, very long ramps that would go up the side of the buildings so that you could literally walk the horses up to the different floors. Now, they were actually quite steep because obviously you're going up a building, so they weren't exactly really low and flat. They were quite a steepness to them. And then as you would go up the building, there would be gangways around the outside of it, which would then lead into the stalls. So literally the horses would be walking around the building, kind of on a bit of a kind of balcony as such, just, you know, overlooking the streets of London, wind in their hair and so on. But like I say, it would have been totally normal to the horses. They wouldn't have thought much of it. And out on these gangways would be where they would be groomed as well. So like I say, they'd be tied up, having a good groom, just looking out at the view. With so many horses living on site, they would have had their own vet, own farrier, they'd have had a harness room, they would have had literally everything they needed there. They'd have even had like a whole separate kind of like stalls area as a sick bay for any horses that had injuries or illness. Like, it would have been a pretty good setup. And generally speaking, the railway horses were fairly well treated compared to some of the other horses that had to work in London back in that period of time. So, you know, as it goes, they didn't have a bad life really, and they would have been well cared for and well fed. Because of the lack of space at Mint stables, all the straw, hay and feed for the horses was kept outside of London. In fact, was kept at Didcot. I mean, obviously being a railway company, it wasn't that hard to bring it in on the trains when it was needed. Some interesting facts at Mint stables was that they filed the horses by colour. So you would literally have a row of stalls of just the grey horses, a row of stalls of just the bay horses, a row of stalls of the chestnuts and so on, which probably looked pretty cool when you walked through and you just saw all chestnut bottoms standing out at the back of the stalls. But I sort of don't really know why they do that. Maybe grooms just got assigned kind of the grey stalls or the bay stalls or however it worked, but I thought that was quite interesting. Also, they would hang the stall partitions from the ceiling because supposedly it was a lot easier to help get horses out if they got stuck. I mean, horses could just about lay down in the stalls, but it wasn't very easy. There wasn't a lot of space, and so it would quite often happen that if they tried to roll over or something like that, they'd get their legs caught. So yeah, by having the partitions hanging from the ceiling, it was a lot easier to quickly remove them and get the horse up. I've mentioned so many times that life expectancy of horses back in that period of time was very short. They were lucky if they made their 8th or 9th birthday. So that meant there was always quite a turnaround of horses coming and going from Mint stables. And a lot of the horses would come in from farms across the country, which would mean that these young horses wouldn't have seen sights such as London before. And so it was quite nerve-wracking for them. So what they would do is they would buddy them up with an older pro horse who could show them the ropes. And for the first few weeks, they'd go out with the older horse and hopefully gain lots of confidence. Kind of the same I do here when it comes to taking the horses out on the road. I'll often lead them off of Corporal first so that they can gain confidence for him, and he'll show them that, you know, all this traffic isn't a problem. Also, the horses there would get into such a routine that literally the grooms didn't even have to hold them. So once they'd finished doing their work for the day, they'd get back to the yard, and it said that they'd literally take themselves up the ramps and back to their stalls without a groom leading them, which I thought was very sweet. I mean, they must have been absolutely knackered after each work session. Mint stables nearly ran 24/7. That was because horses and wagons were often leaving the stables at 2 a.m. in the morning to head off to the markets in London, like the fish market, the flower market or so, to collect the goods that would then need to be taken back to the train station to be loaded onto the train. So these horses were leaving the yards in the pitch black and heading out onto the London streets off to the markets. Now, obviously they had lamps on their wagons, but still it would have been very gloomy. And remember back then, it was very smoky and foggy, so really they wouldn't have been able to see very much. So incredibly brave of these horses. as always, it just makes me wish I could time travel and be like a fly on a wall in a place like that, because it's been quite an operation. You'd have obviously had kind of the head stable grooms, or whatever you want to call them, and then the stable boys that would have probably done most of the hard work when it came to like mucking out the stalls and grooming horses and getting their harnesses on. I mean, you can just imagine how busy this place would have been. Horses going up the ramps, horses going down the ramps, horses being backed into wagons, horses going to the farrier all the time, because they went through shoes like there's no tomorrow back in that period of time, because they were trotting up and down the London cobbles day in, day out. Shoes just didn't last. The last shunting horse at Paddington Station was in 1925, and actually Mint Stables didn't close until 1955, which really surprised me because that's quite late. You think, I mean, the motor car had been around for a good 40 years by then, if not a little bit longer, so you'd think they wouldn't need horses anymore. But yeah, it didn't close until 1955. I can't imagine they had many horses housed there when it did come to closing it. And then St Mary's Hospital, which was right next door to it, took over the stable block and turned it into hospital offices and research labs. And still to this day, it's part of the hospital, and it is called the Mint Wing, which I love. And if you go there, you can really see that the building looks very similar to it did all those years ago. So like if you look at the brickwork, you can see the kind of old shaped stall windows which would have been left open to let as much air flow through the stalls. And yeah, the building hasn't changed hugely. And the thing I love even more is that the horse ramps are still there. So they've got these big white horse ramps that went up the side of the building, which is how the horses got to the second and third floor, and they are still there to this day. In fact, they are used by the people going into the hospital, which is just unbelievable. That's why I always say they don't make things like they used to, because they're still standing, and that's incredible. So yeah, if you're ever in London in that kind of area, go and have a quick look, because yeah, it's amazing. It's such incredible history, and the fact that it's still standing, I love, love, love. So I hope you've enjoyed this vlog. As you can see, I did absolutely zero tack cleaning. Because I've got so much information to remember, I cannot multitask when it comes to doing a history vlog. The best I can do is just stand and face my phone and just try and get all the information off. And hopefully I've filled this vlog full of amazing pictures and photos so that you don't have to just see this face the whole time. Anyway, guys, have an amazing Christmas, and I will see you back next week with another vlog. Merry Christmas!